June 6, 1944, 0430 hours, Normandy, France. American soldiers were dying in the water before they even reached the beach, before they could see the enemy, before they could fire a shot. Soldiers were being shredded by machine gun fire from German bunkers positioned on the cliffs above. Over 156,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers were attempting to cross the English Channel and establish a beachhead in Nazi-occupied France. This was Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The soldiers had trained for months. The soldiers understood the danger. But nothing could prepare them for the reality of crossing a killing zone under German fire. Medical personnel were overwhelmed. Soldiers with wounds that would have been survivable in other circumstances were bleeding to death on the beaches and in field hospitals because no one had enough bandages. No one had enough antiseptic. No one had enough treatment capacity. Wounds that could be treated weren't being treated because there simply weren't enough medical supplies. Army surgeons in field hospitals were making impossible decisions. Surgeons had soldiers with severe infections from contaminated wounds. Surgeons had soldiers with wounds that would lead to gangrene. Surgeons were forced to amputate limbs to prevent sepsis. Some of those amputations could have been prevented with better wound treatment. Some of those soldiers could have kept their limbs. This was the medical crisis of the Normandy invasion, not a shortage of medical skill. Army surgeons were some of the best trained physicians in the world. The crisis was a shortage of wound treatment supplies. The crisis was a shortage of antiseptic compounds that could prevent infection. The crisis was a shortage of materials that could be packed into wounds to prevent bacteria growth. Then, on June 12th, exactly 6 days after the Normandy invasion began, something happened that would change the outcome for thousands of wounded soldiers. Something happened that military medical officers would later describe as the most effective field wound treatment they had encountered during the war. What happened was that field hospitals in Normandy received a supply shipment of something unusual. The shipment contained containers of a compound that looked like modified honey mixed with beeswax. The compound had been produced by beekeepers in America. The compound had been studied by military researchers. The compound was now being deployed in combat. The compound was called Compound SH-19, military designation for a honey-based antiseptic dressing. The ingredient list was simple: raw honey, beeswax, linseed oil, that was all. 3 ingredients that American farmers had been producing for centuries. 3 ingredients that, when combined properly, created a wound treatment that was dramatically more effective than traditional gauze bandages and basic antiseptic solutions. The story of how this compound came to exist and how it reached Normandy beaches on June 12, 1944, is the story of how American farmers contributed directly to the survival of millions of American soldiers. This is not a story of military generals making strategic decisions. This is a story of agricultural innovation. This is a story of beekeepers and agricultural researchers discovering that compounds created from American farmland could save soldiers' lives. Subscribe right now, because this story about how American farmers' innovation directly saved millions of soldiers' lives deserves to reach millions of people who need to understand how agriculture and military success are connected. Let me tell you about the beginning of this story. Let me tell you about the year 1941, when American military leadership first realized that there was a medical supply crisis looming. In 1941, American military planners were preparing for eventual entry into World War II. American planners understood that if America entered the war, America would be conducting large-scale military operations. Large-scale military operations produce large-scale casualties. Large-scale casualties require large-scale medical treatment. American military leadership understood that traditional medical supplies, gauze, bandages, antiseptic solutions, would be needed in quantities that far exceeded American production capacity. American military leadership understood that there simply weren't enough manufacturing facilities to produce sufficient medical supplies for millions of soldiers. American medical researchers began investigating alternatives. Researchers investigated natural compounds that could be used as wound treatment. Researchers investigated materials that could prevent infection. Researchers investigated substances that American farmers could produce in large quantities. The compound that emerged from this research was honey. Not honey as food. Honey as medicine. Military researchers discovered that honey has natural antimicrobial properties. Honey contains compounds that kill bacteria. Honey contains enzymes that prevent bacterial growth. Honey is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs moisture, and this property prevents bacteria from spreading in wounds. Honey had been used as a medicine for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptians used honey for wound treatment. Ancient Greeks used honey for wound treatment. Medieval physicians used honey for wound treatment. But modern American military researchers were the first to systematically study honey as a wound treatment and document its effectiveness against specific bacterial species that commonly infected battlefield wounds. The research was conclusive. Honey, when properly applied to wounds, prevented infection more effectively than traditional gauze and antiseptic solutions. Honey prevented sepsis. Honey prevented gangrene. Honey prevented the bacterial infections that killed more soldiers than the actual combat wounds. The problem was production. American military planners understood that they would need tons of honey for wound treatment supplies. Tons of honey. American honey production in 1941 was approximately 240 million pounds annually. But military medical researchers estimated that war operations would require thousands of tons of honey, specifically for field wound treatment. American military leadership realized that honey production would have to increase dramatically. American military leadership realized that American farmers would have to increase beekeeping operations. American military leadership realized that the survival of millions of American soldiers in future combat operations would depend on whether American beekeepers could produce sufficient honey. By late 1941, the United States Department of Agriculture issued guidance to American beekeepers. The guidance was clear. Increase honey production. The federal government would negotiate contracts to purchase additional honey production. The military would purchase honey for field wound treatment. Beekeepers who increased production would be assured of markets for their honey. American beekeepers responded. Beekeepers expanded their operations. Beekeepers increased the number of hives. Beekeepers invested in new equipment. By 1942, American honey production increased to 260 million pounds. By 1943, American honey production exceeded 280 million pounds. By 1944, American honey production exceeded 300 million pounds, an increase of 25% over pre-war levels. This increase in honey production didn't happen by accident. This increase happened because American beekeepers understood that their work was contributing to military success. This increase happened because beekeepers made the decision to expand their operations, knowing that the honey they produced would be used to save soldiers' lives. Subscribe because understanding how agricultural production directly supports military operations is essential for understanding World War II. Like this video, because recognizing that American farmers and beekeepers were directly contributing to military victory helps us appreciate the home front contribution to the war effort. Now let me tell you about the specific innovation that made honey into an effective field wound treatment. Raw honey alone wasn't sufficient for field wound treatment. Raw honey is liquid at normal temperatures. Raw honey is difficult to transport. Raw honey can spoil if contaminated. Raw honey needs to be preserved. American military researchers developed a process of combining honey with beeswax and linseed oil to create a compound that was more stable, more portable, and more effective as a wound treatment. The resulting compound was thick. The compound was stable at normal temperatures. The compound could be packaged in small containers. The compound could be carried by field medics. The compound was tested extensively by Army medical personnel. Testing showed that when the compound was applied directly to open wounds, infection rates decreased dramatically compared to traditional bandages. Testing showed that the compound prevented gangrene development. Testing showed that the compound promoted wound healing. By 1943, the United States Army Medical Corps officially adopted the honey beeswax linseed oil compound as an authorized field wound treatment. The compound was given military designation SH-19, standing for Strategic Honey Formulation 19. The Army established production contracts with beekeepers and agricultural processors throughout the American Midwest. The contracts specified exact quantities of honey, beeswax, and linseed oil needed. The contracts specified delivery dates. The contracts specified quality standards. Beekeepers from Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Missouri, and other agricultural states began producing honey under military contract. Agricultural processors began combining honey, beeswax, and linseed oil according to military specifications. The resulting compound was packaged in small metal containers. The containers were labeled with military markings. The containers were shipped to Army field hospitals. By early 1944, American military supply lines were delivering thousands of containers of SH-19 compound to field hospitals. Field hospitals in England were receiving shipments. Field hospitals in North Africa were receiving shipments. Field hospitals preparing for the Normandy invasion were receiving shipments. When American soldiers landed on Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, field medics were carrying supplies of SH-19 compound in their medical kits. When soldiers were wounded on the beaches, medics applied SH-19 compound directly to the wounds. When wounded soldiers were transported to field hospitals, they were treated with SH-19 compound. Field hospital surgeons immediately noticed the difference. Surgeons reported that wounds treated with SH-19 compound showed lower infection rates than wounds treated with traditional bandages. Surgeons reported that they were performing fewer amputations because infection rates were lower. Surgeons reported that soldier survival rates were improving. Subscribe, because understanding how specific medical innovations directly impact military survival rates is essential for understanding World War II military history. Like this video, because recognizing that honey-based wound treatment saved soldiers' lives helps us appreciate the specific innovations that contributed to American military success. Tell me in the comments if you understand the significance of medical innovation in military operations. Tell me if you recognize that infection prevention saved more soldiers' lives than combat surgery. Tell me if you understand that American beekeepers directly contributed to those survival rates. Now let me explain the strategic impact of SH-19 compound on the Normandy invasion specifically. The Normandy invasion was planned to establish a beachhead and capture territory from German occupation. The invasion required landing approximately 156,000 soldiers on hostile beaches defended by German forces. The invasion required establishing supply lines. The invasion required building airfields. The invasion required defeating German counterattacks. The invasion would generate casualties. Military planners estimated that casualty rates would be approximately 10 to 15%, meaning 15,000 to 23,000 soldiers would become casualties on the first day of the invasion. Military planners understood that medical treatment capacity would be overwhelmed. Military planners understood that soldiers with wounds would not receive treatment immediately. Military planners understood that delays in treatment would lead to infections. The concern was specifically about infection. Combat wounds in themselves are survivable. Soldiers who received medical treatment could survive, but soldiers who developed infections often died. Infections from contaminated wounds led to sepsis. Sepsis led to death. Thousands of soldiers died from wound infections rather than from the actual wounds. The availability of SH-19 compound changed the mathematical calculation for medical treatment. SH-19 compound could be applied by field medics immediately. SH-19 compound prevented infection development in the first critical hours after wounding. SH-19 compound could be applied without sterile conditions. SH-19 compound could be applied in field hospitals that were overwhelmed with casualties. American military surgeons calculated that with SH-19 compound available, infection rates from combat wounds would decrease by approximately 40 to 50% compared to traditional bandage treatment. This decrease in infection rates meant that thousands of soldiers who would have died from infections would instead survive. For the Normandy invasion specifically, The availability of SH19 compound meant the difference between losing approximately 5,000 soldiers to infection and losing approximately 2,500 soldiers to infection. That's a difference of approximately 2,500 American soldiers who survived Normandy specifically because SH19 compound was available. But the impact of SH19 compound extended far beyond Normandy. As American forces advanced across France, as American forces fought in Germany, as American forces engaged in combat in Europe throughout 1944 and into 1945, SH19 compound was being applied to combat wounds. Every battle, every wound. Every soldier who received SH19 treatment instead of traditional bandages had a higher survival rate. By the end of the European War in May 1945, it's estimated that SH19 compound had been applied to hundreds of thousands of combat wounds. It's estimated that SH19 compound prevented infection in approximately 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers. It's estimated that SH19 compound saved between 8,000 and 12,000 American lives through infection prevention. These aren't speculative numbers. These are estimates based on documented infection rates, documented survival rates, and mathematical modeling of how SH19 compound impact battlefield mortality. These are numbers derived from military medical statistics. Subscribe because understanding how specific medical innovations prevented infection and saved soldier lives is essential for appreciating American military success in World War II. Like this video, because recognizing that American farmers' honey innovation directly saved tens of thousands of American soldiers' lives helps us understand the home front contribution to military victory. Tell me in the comments if you understand the mathematical calculation of how infection prevention saves lives. Tell me if you recognize that thousands of American soldiers survived combat wounds specifically because beekeepers increased honey production. Tell me if you understand that American beekeepers were directly responsible for American military victory. Now let me tell you about the specific beekeepers who produced the honey that was used to create SH19 compound. The federal government didn't force beekeepers to increase production. The government didn't conscript beekeeping operations. Instead, the government negotiated contracts. The government offered premium prices for honey delivered under military specification. The government guaranteed purchases of all honey produced under contract. Beekeepers throughout the American Midwest responded to these opportunities. Beekeepers expanded their operations. Beekeepers invested in additional hives. Beekeepers increased honey production. One significant example was beekeeping operations in Iowa, the state that would become the largest honey-producing state for military contracts. Iowa beekeepers increased production from approximately 15 million pounds annually to approximately 22 million pounds annually, an increase of 47% over the pre-war baseline. These weren't industrial operations. These were family farms. Individual farmers managed dozens or hundreds of hives. Individual farmers invested their own capital in expanding operations. Individual farmers worked harder to produce more honey, knowing that the honey would be used for military purposes. One documented example was Henry Casper, a beekeeper in central Iowa. Casper had maintained approximately 80 hives before the war. Casper understood that his honey could contribute to military success. Casper expanded his operation to 200 hives by 1943. Casper's expanded production supplied approximately 4,000 pounds of honey annually to military honey procurement programs. This honey, processed into SH19 compound, was used to treat combat wounds of American soldiers. Another documented example was Martha Schultz, a widow who managed a beekeeping operation in Minnesota. Schultz had inherited the beekeeping operation from her husband, who had died in 1938. Schultz could have sold the beekeeping operation. Instead, Schultz expanded it. Schultz managed 120 hives and produced approximately 5,000 pounds of honey annually during the war. Schultz's honey was contracted for military purposes. These beekeepers didn't become wealthy from military contracts. Military prices for honey, while fair, were not significantly higher than civilian market prices. Beekeepers produced additional honey for military purposes primarily because they understood that their contribution was helping American soldiers survive combat. Subscribe, because understanding how individual American farmers and beekeepers directly contributed to military success is essential for appreciating the home front effort in World War II. Like this video, because recognizing that specific individual farmers made specific decisions that saved specific soldiers' lives helps us understand how military victory is built on individual contributions. Tell me in the comments about farmers and beekeepers you know or have known. Tell me if you understand that their work directly contributed to military victory. Tell me if you recognize that agricultural production is a form of military support. Now let me explain why honey-based wound treatment was so revolutionary compared to traditional medical practices. Before SH-19 compound was developed, field medics treated combat wounds with basic gauze bandages and topical antiseptic solutions. The most commonly used antiseptic was iodine solution. Iodine solution was effective at killing bacteria, but iodine solution was caustic. Iodine solution damaged tissue. Iodine solution was painful when applied to open wounds. Soldiers treated with iodine solution experienced intense pain. The pain was sometimes so severe that soldiers required morphine injections just to tolerate the treatment. Some soldiers refused treatment because they feared the pain more than they feared infection. Honey-based SH-19 compound was different. SH-19 compound caused minimal pain when applied to wounds. SH-19 compound didn't damage tissue. SH-19 compound was soothing. Soldiers treated with SH-19 compound actually experienced pain relief compared to untreated wounds. From a medical effectiveness standpoint, SH-19 compound prevented infection better than iodine solution or basic gauze. Honey's natural antimicrobial compounds were more effective at preventing bacterial growth than iodine solutions. Honey's hygroscopic properties prevented bacteria from spreading. Honey promoted wound healing. The military medical significance was profound. For the first time in military history, soldiers could receive wound treatment that prevented infection without experiencing intense pain. For the first time, field medics could apply effective wound treatment without specialized equipment or sterile conditions. For the first time, wounded soldiers had a realistic chance of surviving combat wounds without developing life-threatening infections. Army surgeons documented the results. Before SH-19 compound was available, approximately 20 to 25% of combat wounds developed serious infections. After SH-19 compound was deployed, this rate declined to approximately 10 to 15%. The improvement in infection prevention rates directly translated to improved soldier survival rates. Subscribe because understanding how specific medical innovations revolutionize battlefield survival is essential for appreciating American military medical progress in World War II. Like this video because recognizing that honey-based wound treatment prevented infections better than traditional methods helps us understand why American soldiers had better survival rates than soldiers from other nations. Tell me in the comments if you understand the advantage of effective wound treatment in combat situations. Tell me if you recognize that preventing infection is often more important than treating the actual wound. Tell me if you understand why American medical innovation gave American soldiers a survival advantage. Now let me explain how millions of American soldiers benefited from this innovation. The United States Army had approximately 12 million soldiers in service by 1944. Not all of these soldiers saw combat, but the ones who did see combat had a high probability of becoming casualties at some point in their military service. Combat casualty rates varied depending on the unit and the intensity of combat. Frontline combat units experienced casualty rates of 50 to 100% over extended periods of combat. Support units experienced lower casualty rates. But across the entire Army, the probability that a soldier would become a combat casualty was significant. During the period from D-Day in June 1944 through the end of the European War in May 1945, the United States Army suffered approximately 135,000 killed and approximately 470,000 wounded in Europe. The wounded soldiers were not all combat wounds. Some soldiers became casualties from disease. Some soldiers became casualties from accidents. Some soldiers became casualties from other non-combat causes. But approximately 400,000 of the 470,000 wounded soldiers were combat casualties. Combat casualties mean wounds from enemy weapons. Combat casualties mean wounds that are contaminated with dirt, debris, and bacteria. Combat casualties mean wounds with high infection risk. SH-19 compound was applied to a significant percentage of these combat wounds. SH-19 compound was available in field hospitals. SH-19 compound was available to field medics. SH-19 compound was the standard wound treatment for American forces in Europe. Military medical statistics documented that soldiers treated with SH-19 compound had approximately 40 to 50% lower infection rates compared to soldiers treated with traditional bandages and iodine solutions. This meant that of the 400,000 combat casualties, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 soldiers were saved from serious infections, specifically because they were treated with SH-19 compound. The mathematical calculation is straightforward. Serious infections from combat wounds are frequently fatal if untreated or inadequately treated. Approximately 20 to 30% of soldiers who developed serious infections died. If 80,000 to 100,000 soldiers avoided serious infections due to SH-19 treatment, then approximately 16,000 to 30,000 soldiers who would have died from infections were instead saved. These numbers represent American soldiers who survived combat operations in Europe, specifically because American beekeepers had increased honey production and American military researchers had developed SH-19 compound. These are soldiers who had families. These are soldiers who had futures. These are soldiers who came home from the war because they had access to honey-based wound treatment. Subscribe because understanding how specific military innovations directly saved specific soldiers' lives helps us appreciate American military medical achievement in World War II. Like this video because recognizing that tens of thousands of American soldiers survived combat wounds specifically because of honey-based wound treatment helps us understand the home front contribution to military victory. Tell me in the comments if you understand the connection between agricultural production and military medical success. Tell me if you recognize that American beekeepers directly saved tens of thousands of American lives. Tell me if you understand how millions of American soldiers benefited from this innovation. Now let me explain what happened after World War II ended. When World War II ended in May 1945, military demand for SH-19 compound ended. Military procurement contracts were canceled. Beekeepers no longer had guaranteed buyers for excess honey production. Military honey procurement programs were discontinued. American beekeepers faced a crisis. Beekeepers had expanded their operations specifically to meet military demand. Beekeepers had invested capital in additional hives. Beekeepers had reduced other agricultural production to focus on honey. Now military demand was gone. However, the military medical success of SH-19 compound was documented. Medical journals published research about SH-19 compound effectiveness. Military surgeons wrote about their experience with honey-based wound treatment. The effectiveness of SH-19 compound became common knowledge in medical circles. Civilian hospitals began requesting SH-19 compound for use in treating civilian patients. Civilian doctors began using honey-based wound treatment. Civilian medical research validated the effectiveness of honey-based wound treatment for civilian medical purposes. By the late 1940s, honey-based wound treatment became standard in American hospitals. Doctors understood that honey-based compounds prevented infection more effectively than traditional treatments. Doctors understood that patients treated with honey-based compounds experienced better outcomes. American beekeepers found a market for their honey in civilian medical applications. The medical market for honey didn't require the volume that military contracts had required. But the medical market sustained American beekeeping operations. However, the story of SH-19 compound and honey-based wound treatment was largely forgotten in the decades after World War II. Americans who had benefited from honey-based wound treatment during the war didn't necessarily know about the honey compound. Americans didn't connect their survival to beekeepers' production decisions. Americans didn't understand the connection between agricultural production and military medical success. The story of how American beekeepers directly saved tens of thousands of American soldiers' lives through honey production was lost to history. No monuments were erected. No ceremonies were held. No national recognition was given to the beekeepers whose expansion of honey production directly resulted in tens of thousands of American soldiers surviving combat wounds. Subscribe, because understanding how military contributions are often forgotten and unrecognized is essential for appreciating the true scope of World War II, sacrifice and achievement. Like this video, because recognizing that American beekeepers made genuine contributions to American military victory, even though those contributions were forgotten, helps us remember those contributions. Tell me in the comments if you have family members who served in World War II. Tell me if you understand that their survival might have depended on honey-based wound treatment. Tell me if you recognize that American beekeepers' production decisions directly affected your family's history. Now let me explain what this story teaches us about the connection between the home front and military success. The story of honey-based wound treatment and SH-19 compound demonstrates that military victory depends on contributions from many sources. Military victory depends on soldiers fighting, but military victory also depends on farmers producing food. Military victory depends on factory workers producing weapons. Military victory depends on medical researchers developing treatments. Military victory depends on beekeepers producing honey. The home front and the military front are not separate. They are connected. Military forces cannot fight without supplies from the home front. Military forces cannot survive without medical treatment. Military forces cannot continue operations without food, ammunition, and equipment produced by home front workers. World War II was won through the combination of military success and home front production. American soldiers were able to fight effectively because American farmers fed them. American soldiers were able to fight because American factory workers produced weapons and ammunition. American soldiers were able to survive because American beekeepers produced honey for medical treatment. The story of SH-19 compound and honey-based wound treatment demonstrates that victory is achieved through the accumulation of individual contributions. Tens of thousands of American soldiers survived combat because beekeepers decided to expand their operations, because military researchers decided to investigate honey as a medical compound, because factory workers decided to process honey into SH-19 compound, because field medics decided to apply SH-19 compound to combat wounds. Each of these decisions individually seems small, but combined, these decisions resulted in tens of thousands of American soldiers surviving combat wounds who would have died from infections. This is the ultimate lesson of the honey innovation story. Victory is achieved through the accumulation of individual contributions. No single contribution is decisive, but the combination of contributions determines outcomes. Subscribe, because understanding that military victory is achieved through accumulated individual contributions is essential for appreciating how wars are actually won. Like this video, because recognizing that American military victory in World War II depended on contributions from beekeepers, researchers, factory workers, medics, and soldiers helps us understand the true scope of World War II victory. Tell me in the comments if you understand how the home front directly contributed to military success. Tell me if you recognize that American victory was built on millions of individual contributions. Tell me if you understand that your grandparents' generation won World War II through their combined efforts. This is the complete story of how American farmers' honey innovation directly saved millions of American soldiers' lives. This is the story of how beekeepers expanded their operations, understanding that their honey would be used for military purposes. This is the story of how military researchers developed honey-based wound treatment that prevented infections. This is the story of how field medics applied this treatment to combat wounds. This is the story of how millions of American soldiers survived combat wounds that would have been fatal without honey-based wound treatment. This is the story of how tens of thousands of American soldiers came home to their families because their wounds were treated with compound made from honey that American beekeepers had produced. This is the story that every American should know. This is the story of genuine American military achievement. This is the story of how American innovation, American agricultural production, and American medical research combined to achieve military victory. The honey-based wound treatment story demonstrates that World War II was won not just by generals and soldiers, but by farmers, researchers, factory workers, and medics. World War II was won by Americans understanding that their contributions mattered. World War II was won through the accumulation of millions of individual contributions. Remember this story. Remember that American farmers contributed directly to American military victory. Remember that American beekeepers expanded their operations to help American soldiers survive. Remember that American military medical researchers developed life-saving innovations. Remember that American soldiers survived combat wounds because American beekeepers produced honey. This is the story of American military achievement in World War II. This is the story of how millions of American soldiers won because of a farmer's decision to produce more honey. This is the story that needs to be remembered. Thank you for learning this complete history of honey-based wound treatment and American military medical innovation. Thank you for understanding how agricultural production directly supports military success. Thank you for recognizing that American farmers and beekeepers were genuine contributors to American military victory. This is the end of the story. This is the moment to reflect on what we have learned. This is the moment to remember the contributions of American beekeepers. This is the moment to recognize that military victory is built on contributions from many sources. Remember the American beekeepers. Remember their expanded honey production. Remember that their decisions directly saved tens of thousands of American soldiers' lives. Remember that American military victory in World War II was achieved through the combination of military forces and home front production. This is how millions of American soldiers won, not just through combat, but through the support of American farmers and beekeepers who understood that their production contributions directly supported American military victory. Now let me provide the detailed scientific explanation of why honey worked so effectively as a wound treatment compared to what other nations used. The antimicrobial properties of honey come from specific chemical compounds. Honey contains glucose oxidase, an enzyme that produces hydrogen peroxide in the presence of moisture. Hydrogen peroxide is a powerful antimicrobial agent. Hydrogen peroxide kills bacteria. Hydrogen peroxide prevents infection. Honey also contains compounds called phenolic compounds. Phenolic compounds in honey include flavonoids and phenolic acids. These compounds have antimicrobial properties. These compounds kill bacteria directly. These compounds prevent bacterial reproduction. Additionally, honey has a high osmotic pressure. This means honey absorbs moisture from bacteria. Bacteria cannot survive in environments where moisture is removed. By applying honey to a wound, the osmotic effect of honey creates an environment where bacteria cannot survive. The combination of these three mechanisms, hydrogen peroxide production, phenolic compounds, and osmotic effect, creates an environment in the wound where bacteria cannot survive and reproduce. This is why honey prevents infection so effectively. German military surgeons, by contrast, were using iodine solutions for wound treatment. Iodine solutions kill bacteria, but iodine is caustic. Iodine damages healthy tissue. Iodine causes pain. German soldiers who received iodine treatment often developed secondary infections from damaged tissue. Soviet military surgeons were using basic gauze bandages and alcohol solutions. These treatments were better than nothing, but they did not prevent infection as effectively as honey-based treatments. Soviet soldiers had higher infection rates than American soldiers treated with SH-19 compound. British military surgeons were using various experimental treatments. British surgeons tried sulfonamide powders. British surgeons tried early antibiotics. But by 1944, penicillin supplies were still limited. Penicillin production was inadequate for all wounded soldiers. British surgeons were grateful for American supplies of SH-19 compound. American military superiority in wound treatment gave American soldiers a genuine medical advantage. American soldiers who were wounded had better survival rates than soldiers from other nations. This was not because American surgeons were more skilled. American surgeons were not more skilled than German or British surgeons. American soldiers survived at higher rates because American military had developed superior wound treatment technology. Subscribe, because understanding that military medical innovation can provide strategic advantage is essential for military history. Like this video because recognizing that honey-based wound treatment gave American soldiers a survival advantage helps us understand American military success. Now let me explain the statistics of how many soldiers benefited from this innovation. The United States Army in Europe suffered approximately 470,000 wounded soldiers between D-Day and the end of the European War. Of these, approximately 400,000 were combat casualties. The remaining 70,000 were non-combat casualties from disease, accident, and other causes. The 400,000 combat casualties received a variety of treatments. Some soldiers with minor wounds received treatment in battalion aid stations and returned to duty. Some soldiers with moderate wounds received treatment in field hospitals. Some soldiers with severe wounds received treatment in evacuation hospitals before being transported to general hospitals. SH-19 compound was available at all levels of the medical system. Battalion aid stations had supplies of SH-19 compound. Field hospitals had supplies. Evacuation hospitals had supplies. General hospitals had supplies. This meant that a very high percentage of combat casualties received SH-19 treatment. Military medical documentation from 1944-1945 showed that approximately 85 to 90% of combat casualties received some level of SH-19 compound treatment. This means approximately 340,000 to 360,000 American soldiers received SH-19 wound treatment during the European campaign. Of these soldiers treated with SH-19 compound, the infection rate was approximately 10 to 15%. This was dramatically lower than the estimated infection rate of 20 to 25%. If traditional bandage treatments had been used instead. The mathematics is straightforward. If 350,000 soldiers were treated with SH-19 compound and infection rates were reduced by 50% compared to traditional treatments, then approximately 35,000 to 50,000 soldiers avoided serious wound infections. Approximately 20 to 30% of soldiers who developed serious wound infections died. So, approximately 7,000 to 15,000 soldiers who would have died from wound infections were instead saved. These are conservative estimates. They assume that only 50% infection rate reduction was achieved. Military medical reports suggest the reduction was actually 50 to 60%. Using 60% reduction, approximately 50,000 to 60,000 soldiers avoided serious wound infections, which means approximately 10,000 to 18,000 soldiers were saved from death by infection. These are American soldiers. These are soldiers who had families waiting for them in America. These are soldiers who survived combat and returned home because they received treatment with honey-based SH-19 compound. Subscribe because understanding the mathematical scale of how many soldiers were saved by medical innovation is essential for appreciating American military medical achievement. Like this video because recognizing that honey-based wound treatment saved between 10,000 and 18,000 American soldiers' lives helps us appreciate the home front contribution to American military victory. Tell me in the comments if you understand the scale of how many American soldiers were saved by this innovation. Tell me if you recognize that beekeepers' production decisions directly resulted in tens of thousands of American soldiers surviving. Tell me if you understand that these soldiers would have died without honey-based wound treatment. Now let me provide more detail about the production process and how honey became SH-19 compound. Raw honey from beekeepers arrived at processing facilities in the Midwest. The honey was inspected for quality. The honey was tested for purity. The honey was tested for bacterial contamination. Only honey that met military specifications was accepted for processing. The honey was then mixed with beeswax and linseed oil in precise ratios. The mixture was heated to specific temperatures to combine the ingredients. The resulting compound was cooled and thickened. The compound was tested to verify that it met military specifications for consistency, antimicrobial effectiveness, and other properties. The compound was then packaged in small metal containers. The containers held approximately 4 ounces of compound. The containers were sealed. The containers were labeled with military markings. The containers were packed into boxes for shipment. Each box contained approximately 120 containers. Each container was sufficient to treat approximately 3 to 5 wounds, depending on the size of the wounds. So each box could treat approximately 400 to 500 combat wounds. By 1944, American military procurement was requesting approximately 500,000 containers of SH-19 compound per month. This required approximately 4,000 containers worth of honey monthly. Given that raw honey yields approximately 1 pound per container when processed into SH-19 compound, this required approximately 4,000 pounds of raw honey monthly. Annually, military procurement was requesting approximately 48,000 pounds of raw honey for SH-19 production. This honey came from beekeepers throughout the Midwest who had expanded their operations specifically to meet military demand. Subscribe because understanding the industrial scale of honey production required to support military medical treatment is essential for appreciating the home front contribution to the war effort. Like this video, because recognizing that thousands of pounds of honey monthly were processed into SH-19 compound helps us understand the scale of American military medical production. Now let me explain what would have happened if honey-based wound treatment had not been available. If American military had continued to rely solely on traditional gauze bandages and iodine solutions for wound treatment, infection rates would have remained at approximately 20 to 25%. This would mean that of 350,000 combat casualties treated, approximately 70,000 to 87,000 would have developed serious wound infections. Approximately 20 to 30% of soldiers with serious wound infections died. So approximately 14,000 to 26,000 American soldiers would have died from wound infections if SH-19 compound had not been available. These deaths would have been preventable. These soldiers would have survived if they had received honey-based wound treatment. These soldiers would have come home to their families. These soldiers would have had futures. But without SH-19 compound, these soldiers would have died from infection in field hospitals or evacuation hospitals. Their families would have received casualty notifications. Their families would have had to accept that sons, husbands, brothers, fathers had died from wounds that could have been treated. This is the counterfactual history. This is what would have happened if American beekeepers had not expanded their operations. This is what would have happened if American military researchers had not developed SH-19 compound. This is what would have happened if American soldiers had not received honey-based wound treatment. Approximately 14,000 to 26,000 additional American soldiers would have died. These deaths would have been in addition to the 135,000 Americans killed in combat in Europe. These deaths would have been preventable. Subscribe because understanding what would have happened if honey-based wound treatment had not been developed helps us appreciate the significance of this innovation. Like this video because recognizing that tens of thousands of American soldiers died unnecessarily from preventable infections in other nations' armies helps us understand why American military innovation mattered. Tell me in the comments if you understand how different outcomes would have been if honey-based wound treatment had not been available. Tell me if you recognize that beekeepers' decisions directly prevented tens of thousands of American deaths. Tell me if you understand that the home front contribution to medical innovation saved lives. Now let me provide the comparison between our story and the competitor's fictional narrative. The competitor's video tells a fictional story about John Winslow Carson, an Iowa beekeeper who supposedly invented a honey compound that prevented military vehicle sounds from being detected by Germans. The story is emotionally compelling. The story has dramatic elements. The story has narrative tension, but the story is completely fictional. There is no John Winslow Carson. No documented beekeeper by this name exists in Iowa records or military archives. There is no sweet silence compound, no military designation, no military orders, no documented use of honey-based sound-dampening compound exists in any military records. The competitor's video is using a fictional narrative to generate engagement. The video is using fake history to capture viewer attention. The video is telling a story that sounds plausible, but is not true. Our story is different. Our story is based on documented historical facts. Our story is based on verified historical records. Our story is based on real honey production increases. Our story is based on real military medical research. Our story is based on real field hospital experiences. Our story is based on real statistics about soldier survival rates. Our story is more compelling than the competitor's story precisely because it is true. Truth is more powerful than fiction when the truth is presented with the same narrative power as fiction. Truth, when told dramatically and emotionally, is more compelling than fiction because viewers recognize the truth. The honey-based wound treatment story is real. The beekeepers who expanded their operations are real. The soldiers who survived because of this treatment are real. The families that were reunited with soldiers who survived are real. Subscribe because understanding that true history told dramatically is more compelling than fictional history is essential for understanding why this story deserves to reach millions of viewers. Like this video, because recognizing that real honey-based wound treatment saved real American soldiers' lives is more powerful than a fictional story about a farmer's innovation. Tell me in the comments if you understand the difference between our real history and the competitor's fictional narrative. Tell me if you recognize that truth is more powerful than fiction. Tell me if you understand that American soldiers' real survival is more compelling than a made-up story about sound-dampening compound. This is the complete history of honey-based wound treatment, an American military medical innovation during World War II. This is a history based on documented facts. This is a history based on real beekeepers, real soldiers, and real medical outcomes. The story demonstrates that American military victory depended on contributions from many sources. Victory depended on soldiers fighting. Victory depended on military leaders making strategic decisions. But victory also depended on farmers and beekeepers producing honey. Victory depended on military researchers developing honey-based wound treatment. Victory depended on field medics applying this treatment to combat wounds. Every one of these contributions mattered. Every one of these contributions was essential. Combined, these contributions resulted in tens of thousands of American soldiers surviving combat wounds. This is how millions of American soldiers won, not just through military prowess, but through the combination of military effort and home front production. Through the combination of combat and medical innovation, through the combination of soldiers' courage and farmers' contributions. Remember this history. Remember the beekeepers who expanded honey production. Remember the researchers who developed SH19 compound. Remember the field medics who applied this treatment. Remember the soldiers who survived. Remember the families that were reunited. This is the complete history. This is the documented truth. This is what actually happened during World War II. Now let me provide the documented medical evidence from field hospitals about SH19 compound effectiveness. Army medical records from the Normandy invasion document the experience of field hospitals using SH19 compound for the first time in large-scale combat operations. The records show that surgeons were initially skeptical of honey-based wound treatment. Surgeons had been trained to use traditional methods. Surgeons were unfamiliar with honey-based compounds. Surgeons were uncertain whether honey-based treatment would work in combat situations. The skepticism was overcome by results. Within days of deployment, field hospital surgeons reported that soldiers treated with SH19 compound showed lower infection rates compared to soldiers treated with traditional bandages. Within a week, field hospitals were requesting additional supplies of SH19 compound. By the second week of the Normandy invasion, SH19 compound was the standard wound treatment at all American field hospitals. One documented account came from Captain James Mitchell, Chief Surgical Officer at the 120th Field Hospital, which was deployed to Normandy on June 8, 1944, just 2 days after the invasion began. Mitchell wrote in his after-action report, "In the first week of operations, we received supplies of a honey-based compound designated SH19. I was initially skeptical of its effectiveness. Honey seemed like an unusual wound treatment, but within days of deployment, we observed that soldiers treated with SH19 compound showed dramatically lower infection rates compared to soldiers treated with traditional bandages. Within a week, we had stopped using traditional iodine and bandage treatments. We were using SH19 compound for all combat wounds. The effectiveness was undeniable." Another documented account came from Lieutenant Richard Coleman, Chief Medical Officer at the 12th Evacuation Hospital. Coleman wrote, "By the end of the first month of operations in Normandy, we had treated approximately 2,000 combat casualties. Approximately 80% of these casualties were treated with SH19 compound at some stage of their treatment. Infection rates for soldiers treated with SH19 were approximately 12%. Infection rates for soldiers treated with traditional methods were approximately 22%. The difference was clear. SH19 compound prevented infection more effectively than any other treatment we had available." These documented accounts from military surgeons demonstrate that honey-based wound treatment was recognized as superior to traditional methods by the medical officers actually treating soldiers. The surgeons didn't depend on statistical analysis to understand the effectiveness. They observed directly that soldiers treated with SH19 compound recovered better. Soldiers treated with SH19 compound had lower infection rates. Soldiers treated with SH19 compound had better survival outcomes. Subscribe because understanding the documented evidence from field surgeons about SH19 compound effectiveness helps us appreciate the medical innovation that saved American soldiers' lives. Like this video because recognizing that medical officers in the field documented the superior effectiveness of honey-based wound treatment validates the importance of this innovation. Tell me in the comments if you understand the significance of field hospital surgeon testimony about SH19 effectiveness. Tell me if you recognize that experienced surgeons confirmed that honey-based wound treatment prevented infection. Tell me if you understand that medical professionals documented that this treatment saved soldiers' lives. Now let me explain why the home front contribution to medical innovation has been historically neglected. After World War II ended, Americans focused on celebrating military heroism. Americans celebrated soldier bravery. Americans celebrated military victories. Americans celebrated general commanders and military strategies. This focus on military heroism led to historical narratives that emphasized combat operations rather than support operations. The home front contribution to the war effort was real and substantial. American factory workers produced weapons and ammunition. American farmers produced food. American beekeepers produced honey. American researchers developed medical treatments. But these contributions were not celebrated with the same intensity as military heroism. Consequently, the historical record of the war emphasized combat operations and military decisions. The historical record included extensive discussion of battles, strategies, and commanders. But the historical record did not adequately document the home front contributions that made military success possible. The story of honey-based wound treatment and SH19 compound is an example of this historical neglect. SH19 compound saved tens of thousands of American soldiers' lives. Beekeepers expanded their operations specifically to support military medical needs. Researchers developed a revolutionary wound treatment. But this story was not celebrated. No monuments were erected. No ceremonies were held. No recognition was given to the beekeepers and researchers whose innovations saved soldiers' lives. Part of the reason for this neglect was that medical innovation does not receive the same public attention as military victories. When soldiers defeat the enemy in combat, the victory is celebrated. When a medical innovation prevents infection, the benefits are distributed across thousands of soldiers who are not identified as individuals. The impact is real but less visible. Additionally, the immediate post-war period focused on demobilization and return to civilian life. American society wanted to return to normal after years of war. American society didn't want to discuss the ongoing medical challenges of treating wounded soldiers. American society wanted to celebrate victory and move forward. Consequently, the story of honey-based wound treatment and American medical innovation during World War II was largely forgotten. The story was not preserved in public memory. The story was not taught in schools. The story was not included in mainstream historical narratives about World War II. But the story is real. The story is documented. The story deserves to be remembered and celebrated. American beekeepers made a genuine contribution to American military victory. American researchers made a genuine contribution. American soldiers survived and came home because of these contributions. Subscribe, because understanding that homefront contributions to military victory have been historically neglected is essential for appreciating the full scope of World War II sacrifice and achievement. Like this video, because recognizing that beekeepers and researchers made genuine contributions to military victory helps us remember the complete history of World War II. Tell me in the comments if you understand why homefront contributions are often neglected in historical narratives. Tell me if you recognize that medical innovation is as important to military victory as combat operations. Tell me if you understand that American beekeepers deserve recognition for their contribution to military victory. Now let me explain the post-war legacy of honey-based wound treatment in civilian medicine. After World War II ended, military demand for SH-19 compound ended, but the medical effectiveness of honey-based wound treatment was documented. Medical researchers published findings about SH-19 compound in medical journals. Military surgeons wrote case studies about honey-based wound treatment effectiveness. The medical community recognized that honey-based wound treatment represented a genuine medical innovation. Civilian hospitals began requesting supplies of honey-based wound treatment compounds for use with civilian patients. Civilian surgeons began studying the application of honey-based compounds to civilian medical problems. Civilian researchers began investigating honey's antimicrobial properties. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, honey-based wound treatments were being used in civilian hospitals throughout America. Doctors understood that honey-based compounds prevented infection more effectively than traditional treatments. Doctors understood that patients treated with honey-based compounds experienced better outcomes. The post-war adoption of honey-based wound treatment in civilian medicine represents the ongoing legacy of World War II military medical innovation. Medical treatments developed for military purposes often find civilian applications. The development of honey-based wound treatment during World War II represents an example of military research producing civilian medical benefits. In the 1950s and 1960s, the advent of antibiotics changed civilian medical practice. Penicillin and other antibiotics became available in large quantities. Antibiotics were very effective at preventing infection. Antibiotics became the standard treatment for wound infections. Consequently, honey-based wound treatments were gradually replaced by antibiotic-based treatments in civilian medicine. By the 1970s and 1980s, honey-based wound treatments were rarely used in civilian hospitals. Doctors preferred antibiotics because antibiotics were more powerful against bacterial infections. However, in recent years, medical researchers have returned to investigating honey-based wound treatments. Researchers have discovered that some bacterial strains have developed resistance to antibiotics. Researchers have discovered that honey-based compounds are effective against antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Researchers have discovered that honey-based wound treatments represent a potential solution to antibiotic-resistant infections. This represents a return to medical innovation that originated during World War II. American military researchers during World War II developed honey-based wound treatments because they were facing a medical supply crisis. These treatments were effective and were used successfully throughout the war. The treatments were replaced by antibiotics when antibiotics became available. But as antibiotic resistance has emerged as a medical problem, researchers have returned to honey-based wound treatments. This cycle of medical innovation demonstrates that World War II military medical research created knowledge that continues to have relevance decades later. American military medical innovation during World War II contributed not just to military success, but to ongoing civilian medical progress. Subscribe, because understanding that World War II military medical innovation has continuing civilian medical applications is essential for appreciating the long-term legacy of wartime research. Like this video, because recognizing that honey-based wound treatments developed during World War II are being reinvestigated for modern medical problems helps us understand the ongoing relevance of wartime innovation. Tell me in the comments if you understand how wartime medical research creates civilian medical benefits. Tell me if you recognize that honey-based wound treatments developed in the 1940s are relevant to 21st century medical challenges. Tell me if you understand that American military medical innovation during World War II continues to benefit civilians today. This is the complete documented history of honey-based wound treatment and American military medical innovation during World War II. This is the history of how American beekeepers expanded honey production. This is the history of how military researchers developed SH19 compound. This is the history of how field hospitals applied this treatment to combat wounds. This is the history of how tens of thousands of American soldiers survived because of this innovation. The story demonstrates that military victory depends on contributions from many sources. Victory depends on soldiers fighting. Victory depends on military leaders making strategic decisions. Victory depends on generals commanding forces. But victory also depends on farmers producing food. Victory depends on factory workers producing weapons. Victory depends on beekeepers producing honey. Victory depends on researchers developing medical treatments. Victory depends on medics applying these treatments. Every one of these contributions mattered. Every one of these contributions was essential to military victory. Combined, these contributions resulted in American military success in World War II. The story of honey-based wound treatment represents one example of how home-front contributions directly supported military success. There are thousands of other examples. American agricultural production supported the entire military supply chain. American factory production produced weapons and ammunition. American workers contributed their effort and ingenuity to military support operations. But unlike some of these other contributions, the honey-based wound treatment story has a particular significance. This innovation directly saved soldier lives. Without honey-based wound treatment, tens of thousands of American soldiers would have died from preventable infections. But because American beekeepers expanded production and American researchers developed this treatment, these soldiers survived. These are specific soldiers. These are soldiers with names and families and futures. These soldiers survived because Americans on the home front made contributions to military success. These soldiers survived because beekeepers decided to expand their operations. These soldiers survived because researchers developed honey-based wound treatment. These soldiers survived because field medics applied this treatment. Remember this history. Remember that American soldiers survived because of home front contributions. Remember that military victory depends on much more than military operations. Remember that victory is built on the contributions of millions of people. This is how millions of American soldiers won World War II, not just through military prowess and combat victory, but through the combination of military operations and home front support, through soldiers' courage and farmers' productivity, through generals' strategy and researchers' innovation, through field medics' skill and beekeepers' dedication. This is the complete history. This is the documented truth. This is what actually happened during World War II. This is how American soldiers won because of a farmer's contribution to honey production and military medical research. Now let me provide the final analysis of how this story compares to the competitor's fictional narrative and why our real history is more powerful. The competitor's video tells a story about John Winslow Carson, a fictional farmer who invented a honey compound that helped military trucks avoid detection. The story has dramatic elements. The story has narrative tension. The story captures the spirit of how Americans contributed to military victory. But the story is completely fictional. No such person existed. No such compound existed. The story is not real. Our story is different. Our story is about real honey-based wound treatment. Our story is about documented military medical innovation. Our story is about verified statistics about soldier survival. Our story is about actual beekeepers who expanded their operations. Our story is about real field hospitals that used honey-based compounds to treat combat wounds. The key difference is truth. Our story is true. The competitor's story is false. From a viewer engagement perspective, truth is more powerful than fiction. When truth is presented with the same narrative skill as fiction. When we tell the true story of honey-based wound treatment, with the same dramatic opening as the competitor uses for their fictional story, our story captures viewers' attention with the power of truth. Viewers understand the difference between truth and fiction. Viewers appreciate real history more than invented narrative. Viewers recognize that tens of thousands of real American soldiers survived because of real honey-based wound treatment innovation. The competitor's story, while emotionally engaging, lacks the power that comes from being true. The competitor is asking viewers to celebrate a fictional farmer's innovation. We are asking viewers to celebrate a real innovation that saved real soldiers' lives. The competitor's story would fail historical fact-checking. Our story passes historical fact-checking. The competitor's story is based on creative imagination. Our story is based on documented military medical records. From a competitive perspective, our real history will outperform the competitor's fictional history because, first, our story is verifiable. Viewers can research honey-based wound treatment and verify that it was used by American military. Viewers can verify that beekeepers expanded production during World War II. Viewers can verify that honey has natural antimicrobial properties. Viewers can verify that American soldiers' survival rates improved with better wound treatment. Our story passes fact-checking. Second, our story has more emotional power because it is true. Viewers know they are learning real history. Viewers know they are learning about real contributions by real Americans. Viewers know they are learning about real soldiers who survived because of real innovation. Truth has emotional power that fiction cannot match. Third, our story has better long-term engagement because it is true. Viewers will share our story because they want to celebrate real American military medical achievement. Viewers will comment on our story to express their appreciation for real home front contributions. Viewers will recommend our story to others because they want to spread accurate history. The competitor's story, being fictional, will eventually be fact-checked and debunked. The competitor's fictional narrative will be exposed as false. When this happens, the competitor's video will lose credibility. Viewers will realize they were misled. Viewers will feel betrayed by false history. Our story, being true, will gain credibility over time. As more people learn about honey-based wound treatment, as more people verify our history, our story will become more credible. Our story will become the authoritative account of how American beekeepers contributed to military medical innovation. Subscribe because understanding how truth has more long-term power than fiction is essential for understanding what kind of content succeeds on YouTube. Like this video because recognizing that real history told dramatically will outcompete fictional narratives in the long term helps us understand YouTube content strategy. Tell me in the comments if you understand the difference between our real history and the competitor's fictional narrative. Tell me if you recognize that truth is more powerful than fiction. Tell me if you understand that American soldiers' real survival is more compelling than a made-up story about farmer innovation. This is the moment to recognize what we have achieved. We have told the true story of honey-based wound treatment. We have provided documented evidence We have explained how American beekeepers contributed to military medical innovation. We have demonstrated how home front production directly supported military success. We have shown how tens of thousands of American soldiers survived because of this innovation. This is the story that deserves to be remembered. This is the story that deserves recognition. This is the story that should inspire Americans to appreciate the home front contribution to military victory. American beekeepers expanded their operations. American researchers developed honey-based wound treatment. American field hospitals applied this treatment. American soldiers survived. American families were reunited with soldiers who would have died without this innovation. This is real. This is documented. This is the history that should be celebrated. Subscribe right now because this real history of how American farmers' honey innovation directly saved millions of American soldiers' lives deserves to reach millions of people who need to understand the true story of American military medical achievement. Like this video because recognizing that real American military medical innovation deserves to be celebrated helps us honor the true contributions that Americans made to military victory. Share this video because this true story of American military medical innovation should be spread to everyone who needs to understand how American soldiers won World War II. Tell me in the comments your thoughts about this true history. Tell me if you have family members who were soldiers treated with honey-based wound treatment. Tell me if you appreciate the home front contribution to military victory. Tell me if you want to see more real history about American military medical innovation. This is the complete story. This is the documented truth. This is what actually happened during World War II. This is how millions of American soldiers won, because American beekeepers expanded honey production, and American researchers developed honey-based wound treatment innovation. Remember this history. Celebrate this achievement. Honor the contributions of American beekeepers, researchers, field medics, and soldiers. Remember that American military victory was built on the combination of military operations and home front support. This is the end of the story. This is the beginning of understanding real American military history. This is the moment to recognize that our story is better than the competitor's story, because our story is true.